Coming up on today's show, what if you don't like any of the candidates on the ballot? Should you be given a none of the above option? Protests taking place outside hospitals, people at each other's throats. How did we get here? We'll chat with Tom Nichols, author of Our Own Worst Enemy and the Death of Expertise, and what's going on with drinking water on Alberta First Nations, Canadian First Nations. In fact, all the parties seem to be in agreement, but we never get anywhere. Well, every single time we've ever held an election in this country, people will tell you, I don't like any of these parties. Politicians are all the same. You've heard it all before, right? And I don't necessarily disagree with them on a lot of counts. There's always talk about spoiling ballots, which some people do. Not enough to make a difference, though. It may make you feel good, but it doesn't actually really send any message. Your spoiled ballot is counted as a rejected ballot. They're all lumped together, so no reason is noted. It's not really filed under this person thinks you all stink and we all need to do better. No, it's just filed with the same as someone who messed up and accidentally marked the wrong square, whatever the case may be. So you're not really getting a chance to express your displeasure. Maybe we should. Would that help? Let's find out. We're going to chat with Dr. Richard Johnson, who is a political science professor at the University of British Columbia. Dr. Johnson, thanks so much for your time today. I appreciate you joining us.
Good morning.
Do we need that? Do we need a method of registering our dissatisfaction? Should there be a none of the above option for voters?
I absolutely think we should not. I think it's a really bad idea. I mean, it's true if you spoil your ballot, there's no concrete record of why you did so.
Right.
But at least you've actually decided to repudiate the format. The fact that people are unhappy with the political order is pretty widely established, right? It comes through in opinion polls, it comes through in talk shows, but to actually try to embody that on the ballot is inviting people, making it easy for people explicitly to abandon their obligations as citizens to make a choice. What's more, we don't know this for a fact, so this what I'm about to say is a conjecture.
Okay.
But the people who feel that way are disproportionately on the right side of the political streak. So you're Aaron O'Toole. You want to encourage people who might otherwise vote for you to vote for nobody? That's nuts. So that's my reaction. We have rights as citizens, but with rights come obligations. And
yes.
In this case, we are choosing who shall govern. Now, it's true, any individual has much less impact on the outcome of an election, given that there are millions of votes being cast, than the election outcome has on your life. That's true. An election is a collective good. But at the end of the day, if you abandon the opportunity to have a say in who shall govern, then you have fallen down on your job as a citizen.
Fair enough. Yeah, I agree with you. And the other issue here is when you're talking about politicians, and I think a lot of people do it as a bit of a middle finger to the politicians. You all stink, right? The fact of the matter is the politicians are more interested in the people who do vote for them. That's all they care about. You know, they're only interested in getting one more vote than they need to win.
And let's just step back. Imagine if they didn't. Imagine if they didn't want your vote. So, of course, there are abuses of process. There's pandering. There's cheap talk by politicians as well. It does happen. Imagine the alternative.
Yeah, exactly, right? Question. A lot of people don't vote, right? I mean, we always have a bit of a tough time getting voter turnout to where it should be, depending on the election. Isn't that a pretty good expression in we don't care and we don't like any of you? Is that not a benchmark?
Well, that's clearly some of it. Now, if you think about non-voting, it actually has many components, right? So even in relatively high turnout elections that we think of as expressions of enthusiasm, 2015, the first time round for Justin Trudeau, in fact, was by recent standards at least, a very high turnout election, but it was still the case that 30% of the registered voters did not turn out. At the very high point in Canadian turnout history, we're now talking 50 years ago, when turnouts were closer to 80%, we're still talking about one voter in five, or one eligible voter in five who doesn't turn out. So there's always going to be a kind of inertia component here that isn't necessarily repudiation of the process. It's just that voting itself is modestly costly. You got to know where the polling station is.
Yep.
You got to take some time to get there. You may have to take some time off work. And so there's that. Of course, there's also variation across the landscape in how much difference subjectively your vote makes. And so, you're sitting in Alberta. Fact is, the Conservatives win by such margins, it really doesn't matter whether or not you turn out. Whereas in suburban Vancouver, where we have races decided by 150 votes, there's out in Port Coquitlam, there's a constituency in which the Conservative winner won by 150, but each of the Liberals and the NDP were basically 100. So that's a very different situation. So you have a lot of, think of them as chronic factors, or at least factors that vary in a way that aren't necessarily about disaffection. So there's that. But it's also true that if you look over the historical picture of turnout does go up when there's an attractive feature on the landscape, or where there's a really big question clearly in play, as in 1988, which was in effect a referendum on Canada-U.S. free trade. So it was more than just choosing a government. So you can see that turnout goes up and down according to the overall mood of the moment, and we're in a moment where the mood is pretty sour.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, like you say, in an ideal world, we'd have the informed electorate that some say is a requirement of democracy, and we wouldn't have a need for spoiled ballots or none of the above options. But how do we do that? How do we get you have the right to vote, you have the right not to vote, and you have the right not to care.
Well, at some level, you might say you don't have the right not to care, but practically speaking, you do.
Yeah.
The problem is that it goes back to a point I made earlier. An outcome of an election is a collective good. What you and I personally do next Monday probably won't matter very much in terms of the determination of who wins or loses, riding by riding or overall, because of the millions of us who will do it. So that's a collective good, and the deal with collective goods is that you get something for which you don't have to pay. It's like having a lighthouse. That encourages free riding. That encourages letting other people make the decision. Some of it's a kind of a structural feature of the system that you can't get away from, right? Canada has 37 million people. It's going to have an enormous electorate regardless of what. So that's a permanent problem. So you sort of ask, well, what are the shortcuts? How can people figure out what's at stake for them in a way that is realistic, that has a realistic cost burden for them? Well, honestly, I'm going to tell you something that a lot of people don't like to hear. It's political parties, right? Mm-hmm. Albertans know what they think of Justin Trudeau, and they know why.
Yes.
Right? There's a sense in which it's not some random guy who drops from heaven. He is the leader of a particular political party with a history, with an ongoing set of commitments that lean in a particular direction. Ditto for Aaron O'Toole. Now, actually, O'Toole is trying to modify that.
Yes.
Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. But there's a sense in which the Conservative Party is also setting its signals. And at the end of the day, clarity in the choice amongst particularly the prime contenders for government is a massive aid for voters. And it is perfectly reasonable for voters to use shortcuts, to hang their decision on reasonably clear signals of what the party stands for. And honestly, the parties are pretty distinct in this country.
Yep.
And now, events like last Thursday's debates, frankly, don't help. I mean, that was an exercise in obfuscation, even where the leaders tried not to. They actually tried to get through, and they just were stopped after 40 seconds. But there's various things we could do. We could indeed have a much better system of debates, and I'm old enough to remember a string of debates over 20 to 25 years where they were engaging exercises. They were compelling television, and you came out of those debates as a viewer with some sense of what's really at stake here. We might want to ask ourselves whether we can't go back to debates that are clearly between the parties that conceivably could form the government.
Doc, unfortunately, we're out of time, but I really appreciate the discussion this morning. Thank you for joining us.
You're welcome.
Dr. Richard Johnson, a political science professor at the University of British Columbia. So we started the show talking about people, believe it or not, protesting outside of hospitals today. And we've seen it in this country before, and it's led to ambulances being delayed and all the rest. And I asked the question, how did we get here? Because I firmly believe if it wasn't vaccine mandates for healthcare workers or masks or whatever, it would be something else, because that's the world we live in now. That's the state of play. People are angry about something all of the time. Tom Nichols is an author who wrote The Death of Expertise, a great book which fits very well with where we are. And his new book, Our Own Worst Enemy, The Assault from Within on Modern Democracy, doesn't continue from that book, but it fits perfectly where we are today. He's actually really touched with these two books into sort of the climate that we're all living in, and I'm delighted he could join us now. Tom, thanks so much for your time this morning. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Shay. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, so we're taking a look. I mean, I don't know if you know what's going on. We're in the middle of an election campaign. We've got a vote 7 days from today, Tom. But the talk of the country today for a lot of people is the fact that right across the country, this group has organized to have protests outside of hospitals because they're angry that frontline healthcare workers have to get vaccinated or they're not allowed to work in these hospitals. It just seems so extreme. But it's a continuation, right? We've seen this kind of behavior where people just seem to get angry about everything.
It is a continuation, and it's been going on for a long time. It's part of a growing narcissism in Western society, not just in the United States. I think somewhat less so in Canada. I mean, in the United States, we've really raised narcissistic anger to an art form here in America. But it's part of life in a developed, advanced technological democracy where people are bored and narcissistic, and they are used to high standards of living, and they want to basically get out in the street and tell everyone else that you're not the boss of me, and everyone should listen to them. And it is. It's an unseriousness that has serious consequences, but it's something that's been building, I would say, since at least the early 1970s. And now with a combination of things, including a long period after the end of the Cold War of peace and affluence, very high standards of living rising very rapidly, and a narcissistic, disengaged public on social media watching 24 hours of cable news every day. We literally have started, millions of us have literally started to just lose our minds about everything. And that you're seeing the evidence, you're seeing the results of it now.
Yeah, exactly. And I think when you make a good point, because you talk about, the 24-hour media cycle, the whole media ecosystem, and it's broken up and fragmented in so many ways. You have the narcissistic, entitled, you're not the boss of me crowd, but there's that media ecosystem and politicians, let's be honest here, who stoke that anger to their own benefit with no regard for the consequences. They're happy to get that anger and that mobilization to their own benefit. And that's part of the problem here, isn't it?
Absolutely. Nobody runs for office by saying, things are basically good. They could be better. I'll do a little bit better than the other guy, but, the other guy's not a monster. And, I tell a story right at the beginning of the book where my very conservative dad, I grew up, I was a Republican for many years. My father was a very conservative Republican. The last election of his life, he was watching Romney run against Obama, and I said, I don't think Romney's going to make it, Dad. And he said, you know what? They're both good men. We're going to be fine. We're going to be fine either way. You won't hear that now. And also, you can't get people to vote for you. You can't get people to glue their eyes to your Facebook memes. You can't get people to go down the rabbit hole of YouTube. You can't get people to watch 4 straight hours of news every night, news programming. I don't want to call it news, opinion programming. Yeah. And you can't get people out to vote by saying, you know what, we're basically okay. We're all decent people. It's going to be fine. You're going to lose on some things that you like. You're going to win on other things you like, but we're doing well, and we live in a pretty good place here in the West, and that's gone because you have people all day long just infusing this message into your brain. This is the worst time ever. Everybody's out to screw you. Nothing has ever been good. These are the worst times ever. And sooner or later, if you repeat it enough times, you start to believe it.
That's the thing, Tom. People always say, well, we've lost critical thinking. We don't have critical thinking. It's not about critical thinking. I don't care who you are or how intelligent you are. If you're bombarded with the same message, you pick who you follow on Twitter and on Facebook. So you're going to get the same message day after day. Eventually, it's going to take a toll.
Yeah, it's not about critical thinking. And I hate to say this as an educator because, people always think, well, more education is the answer. Look, some of the most anti-democratic and illiberal people in the United States are my age. 55, 60, 65 years old. I'm 60. These are people who lived through the golden age of public education in America, where we all studied civics, we all said the Pledge of Allegiance, we all had to know about the Supreme Court, all of that stuff. And, education is not a firewall against narcissism. And the best example I can give you, Shay, of a different kind of problem. It's sort of like saying, here in the 21st century, we have never had more food and healthier food and more access to different kinds of food. When you and I were younger, everybody told us we'd be starving by the 21st century, when in fact we're up to our necks in food, right? But why are people obese and diabetic? Because they eat crap, because they eat terrible food, because they want to. And you can't blame your local fast food outlet, and you can't blame the candy aisle at the grocery store. We eat that stuff because we want to. We watch cable news all night because we want to, because it's a rush, because it gives us a trigger rush of dopamine, and of anger and involvement and this fight or flight response that people want that. And that's unfortunate. That says something about us. And how we search for meaning in our lives, that the only meaning we can find is by constantly being angry.
And that's the thing. We can talk about, if it's not masks, it's vaccines. If it's not vaccines, it's vaccines. It doesn't matter. If the pandemic ended today, this would still be an issue because there'd be another issue to go into the streets.
Then we'd go back to fighting about critical race theory and pronouns and, parking spaces, you name it. We would find something. We'd argue about, we'd all be in a rage about whether or not we can say Merry Christmas. I mean, that was a big deal in the United States for a while, right? Oh, there's a war on Christmas and you can't say Merry Christmas. And I mean, this is utter nonsense that is irrelevant to the way people actually live their lives. But if you're going to sit and watch hours of this kind of anger-creating, rage-producing programming. I mean, I always tell people, I'm a writer. I'm paid to have opinions, and even I don't watch 4 hours of opinion programming every night. But people really do it. They sit there. They sit there from 6 or 7 o'clock right through to 10:30 or 11 o'clock, and by the time they're ready for bed, their brain is just stewing in rage. There's just not much you can't counter that with education. No. What the public needs is self-discipline, and we lack that.
That's the question. We're chatting with Tom Nichols, author of Our Own Worst Enemy, professor of national security affairs. In your first book, The Death of Expertise, you talk about how you were hopeful that something such as a pandemic might return people to respecting expertise in science and relying on the people who know what the hell they're talking about. Unfortunately, it's not playing out that way for a large segment of our population. In this book, do you lay out the solution to get people down from the clouds, from that outrage, anger all the time? What do we need to do to get back to a functioning society here?
Well, you're absolutely right that with the death of expertise, when people would ask me what's going to, stop this constant attack on established knowledge and science and facts, I said, well, in times of a national struggle, in wartime, during a depression or a national health crisis like a pandemic, and I said it like 3 years ago without realizing how close we were to one, I said that kind of snaps people out of it. I mean, a lot of this behavior is the luxury of a bored and affluent society that can actually afford to ignore experts because, most of the things that happen around us happen because of expert activity anyway, and you don't really think about it when you get in an elevator. Hey, is this elevator been certified by experts? You just do it. I don't know what the answer is for this ongoing attack on democracy, because I think a lot of people have lost touch with reality. I mean, they genuinely believe stuff that is just crazy. It's not even true. It's not an arguable point. It's not like it's a matter of opinion. I mean, when you get people talking about, Venezuelan voting machines and Italian, internet satellites programmed by communists, I mean, you are way far into crazy town at that point. And I don't think people are going to climb out of that tree willingly. I think what I tell people here in the United States is you're just going to have to outvote them. And that the rest of us are going to have to speak truth, not to power, but to each other. That, the answer to me is in these very small interactions. That uncle that wants to ruin your Christmas dinner, the brother-in-law who wants to start a food fight because he watches too much Fox News and wants to ruin Thanksgiving. I think that's when we turn to them as adults rather than to argue. Facts don't matter here. You turn and say, I'm not having that discussion with you.
See, that's the thing. You're
wrong.
Right. You can't educate or persuade.
You're right, and it's attention-seeking behavior. And I'm sorry to compare, adults to children, but this is toddler-like behavior. To see if
Thanks
they
for
can get a
listening
reaction
today.
out of
To
you.
hear any of our other interviews, you can find them wherever you find your favorite podcast. If you like what you hear, don't forget to rate and review
We're not going to have a long conversation about your theory about why Joe Biden has been, put in office by a bunch of space lizards. We're not going to do that today.
Yeah.
And so I think that is a really important. We have to recover a certain sense of stoicism about this. And I know some people listening will get upset and they'll say, why do we have to be the adults? Why do we have to play fair? Why do we have to be the ones to keep our cool? Well, because that's part of being the adult in the room. That's why.
Yeah, be the grown-up. Someone's got to do it.
Right.
Awesome. Tom, thank you so much for the discussion. Always appreciate it.
Thanks, Shay.
That's Tom Nichols, who is author of Our Own Worst Enemy, professor of national security affairs at the U.S. Naval War College as well. Let's have a discussion here about the federal election campaign. What's one thing you've heard about over and over and over from all of the parties, right? We need clean drinking water on Canada's First Nations. Our Indigenous communities need to have clean drinking water. It's been going on and on and on and on. They all promised to do it, so why haven't we done it? We're going to chat with Carrie Black, an assistant professor and Canada Research Chair of Integrated Knowledge, Engineering and Sustainable Communities at the University of Calgary. Dr. Black, thank you for your time this morning. I really appreciate you joining us.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
It kind of is a bit of a mind bender, a bit of a head scratcher when we've been talking about this, and we're talking about it during this election campaign, but it goes back way, way before this.
Oh, decades long. It's been a promise to achieve water equality and equity for First Nations and Indigenous communities across Canada for well over 30 years.
When we talk about, and it's something we all hear about, and I don't know how, deep down people have drilled into this. What is the situation? How many of these First Nations are we talking about? Is this a widespread problem?
It's definitely a widespread problem. If you just look at long-term advisories, there's over 50 documented long-term advisories, over 30 short-term advisories. But what's missing from all of that is there's a ton of communities who are on individual systems whose water isn't safe to drink. So there's thousands of people impacted by the lack of access to safe, clean drinking water.
And of course, as we've said, political parties have always said, well, this is ridiculous in this day and age that we have this situation going on in such a rich and prosperous nation. But they never seem to follow up on that. Why is that?
It's a great question. It's a source of frustration for me in that it's an easy thing to promise. It seems to go without saying that we should all have safe drinking water, right? To say the opposite would be political suicide. To say I don't agree would be crazy.
Of course.
So of course you're going to agree. And just this morning, even Jagmeet Singh, the leader of the NDP party, commenting on the Prime Minister's broken promises on this exact topic. But no one's actually laying out how they're going to do it. And that's the difficult part, right? It's the how you're going to do it. To assume that you could throw money at it is the wrong assumption. You have to pull back and claw back years and years and years of policies and programs that have been systemically had racism throughout all of it, which has limited First Nations participation in the decision-making process. And
it's like you say, and just to expand on it a bit, it's really easy to talk this talk. It's very simple, but we need to be, as voters and as Canadians, more stringent in making them actually walk the walk after they talk the talk, right?
Absolutely. And even when this original commitment, you'll see across all the party platforms, there's still a reliance to say long-term drinking water advisories. Those are advisories that are in place for over a year. If you said to any non-Indigenous person in a Canadian setting that you're not going to have access to safe drinking water for a year, they'd lose their mind. If you turn off the tap water in downtown Calgary for 2 hours, you're going to hear an uproar about it. So to think that long term is only over a year is crazy. But every political party is still sort of walking the long term advisory talk, or they might say all advisories, but what they really mean are those communities that are on like a water treatment plant, not the ones necessarily that are in individual wells or cisterns and have really struggled with access to safe, clean water.
You know what? We've had discussions before about infrastructure, and essentially this falls under the umbrella of infrastructure largely. And we've had other people say, you know what, we need to get this out of the election campaign cycle. This shouldn't be a campaign issue, a political football. This is something that Canada as a nation is going to do regardless of who's in government. Why have we let it fall to the party saying we can do this and we can do that instead of government, regardless of who's in power, saying this is a priority for Canada?
Well, a big part of this also comes down to the individual voter. There's a lot of, people that might be listening out there across Canada who don't actually realize just how much water costs. How much it actually costs to get water to your tap on a regular basis is quite expensive, but you don't pay very much for it. And so when you have that problem at the individual level, yes, you want to provide safe drinking water, but you don't necessarily want to pay for it. And so there's a real disconnect between what we want versus what we're willing to do. And I think you see that represented in our party leaders. I think they just speak to what they know is important and they have to say. But when it comes to actually walking that talk, that's where we all need to be, standing up with a louder voice, advocating on behalf and with in partnership Indigenous communities to get that talk turned into, the walk part of it. But it's really challenging because it costs a lot of money and it's going to take quite a bit of time.
So now it's back into the middle of another federal election campaign. Are we hearing anything different, anything encouraging this time around? Do you have any more hope that they've actually come up with something, or is it just the same old, well, we're going to talk about it, but we'll see what happens?
Well, I think what you're seeing that's different is that across all parties, you're seeing it as a focus, which was not in place in previous years. You're seeing it across Conservative, NDP, Green, Liberal. Across the gamut, you're seeing a commitment to the drinking water crisis. So that is, in and of itself, different. That being said, the title of the French language debate question was, clean water for all Indigenous communities, ? It's not a question. We've agreed this is a human right. And so if we're going to agree to that, we need to actually show how we're going to do it. What I don't see is actually anyone saying how they're going to achieve it, what they're going to do, what's an action plan, and actually saying, regardless of whether or not I'm elected, this will remain a priority. That's where I think people need to get to, is no matter if you're elected or not, we should all be pushing this forward. We should all be advocating and ensuring that we actually get to water equality and equity for Indigenous people.
Yes. Good question. I don't know if you have the answer, but I'll ask the question. Why is it so hard to provide safe? When we're talking about First Nations, is there anything other than just a lack of will? Is there an actual legitimate reason why this hasn't happened, but it's happened in every other town and municipality across the country? Is there? Why is it?
Well, it's a very complicated issue. One of the key reasons is that, drinking water is typically handled at a provincial level, right? But when it comes to First Nations, it's handled at a federal level. So already there's a different way of playing this game, right? It costs a lot of money. First Nations tend to be in rural and remote areas. There's different ways in which you can tackle the water issue. We also have to remember that, in our history as colonizers, we actually displaced Indigenous people to areas that were of poor drinking water quality. Attawapiskat is a great example of that. In Northern Ontario, we put people in areas with crappy water, for lack of a better, more professional term. And so how do you address that when you've already put people at a disadvantage? So there's policies that are a problem. There's money that tends to be a lingering, long-standing problem. There's lack of access to training and capacity and education. There's rurality and remoteness that's factoring into it. So there's a whole lot of issues that make it a much more complicated, not impossible, but more complicated.
Harder. Yeah, geography is a big one. Dr. Black, great discussion. I really appreciate your time this morning. Thank you.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for joining me. That is Dr. Carrie Black, an assistant professor and Canada Research Chair of Integrated Knowledge, Engineering and Sustainable Communities at the University of Calgary. Thanks for listening today. To hear any of our other interviews, you can find them wherever you find your favorite podcasts. And if you like what you hear, don't forget to rate and review us.